The sunny shores of Clearwater, Florida are alive with joy. Children laugh as they build sandcastles, couples stroll hand in hand, and families gather under colorful umbrellas to soak up the warmth of the sun. The ocean sparkles like diamonds, reflecting the carefree spirits of those who have come to enjoy this perfect day. But just beyond this paradise, tragedy unfolds in silence. A black Labrador retriever, frail and trembling, hangs precariously from a rusted chain on the roof of a crumbling house. Its emaciated body, covered in scars, shows every rib through its thin, mangy fur. Its terrified eyes dart around, pleading for someone to notice, as its legs dangle helplessly above the ground. In a world filled with light and laughter, how can such suffering go unseen? Will anyone save this innocent soul before it's too late? Stay with us, because what happens next will move you in ways you never expected. The soft morning sun filtered through the windows of Claire Dawson's home, casting warm golden rays across the modest living room. The faint crash of waves in the distance blended with the occasional cry of seagulls, creating the idyllic coastal symphony that had greeted Claire every morning since she retired. For most, this setting was a dream, a life of quiet simplicity by the beach. But for Claire, it had become a reminder of what she'd lost. At 60 years old, Claire was a retired police officer who had spent decades chasing justice in the bustling streets of Clearwater, Florida. When she retired 5 years ago, she imagined her days would be filled with peaceful walks along the shore and the satisfaction of tending to her small garden. Yet, the rhythm of this new life often felt hollow. Without her badge, her days lacked the sense of purpose that had once driven her, and without her husband Daniel, who had passed just before her retirement, the silence in her home felt all-consuming. Claire set her coffee mug down on the table, her eyes drifting to the neat rows of flowers outside her window. Her garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could work with her hands and let her mind wander. She often thought about Daniel as she pruned the roses he had planted years ago, the bright petals a stark contrast to the aching void in her chest. Several blocks away, the world was anything but serene. In a dilapidated house at the end of Shoreline Road, Shadow, a black Labrador retriever, struggled for his life. The roof, beneath his trembling paws, was slanted and slick with dew, and a rusted chain tightened around his neck, binding him to the gutter. His ribs jutted out from his emaciated frame, his once lustrous coat patchy and scarred. Each shaky breath he took was a fight, each whimper a plea. Shadow's life had been defined by neglect. Earl Jenkins, his owner, treated him with cruel indifference, often forgetting to feed him or tossing scraps as if he were more nuisance than companion. On good days, Shadow was left chained to a pole in the backyard. On bad days, Earl's temper made him a target for kicks and curses. The rooftop had been his latest prison, a makeshift solution to keep the dog out of sight and out of mind. As the sun climbed higher, the heat intensified. Shadow's paws burned against the shingles, his body too weak to adjust. His desperate attempts to free himself had only tightened the chain around his neck. From the streets below, neighbors began to notice. Some whispered, others gasped in horror, but no one approached the house. Earl Jenkins had a reputation in the neighborhood, a man quick to anger and rarely sober. Back in her kitchen, Claire was finishing her breakfast, contemplating which book to pull from her shelf for the afternoon. Her phone buzzed against the countertop, jolting her from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on a towel and picked it up, expecting another recipe or gardening tip from Mrs. Fletcher, her chatty neighbor. Instead, her brow furrowed as she opened the message. It was a photo. Her breath caught as the image loaded on the screen. A black Labrador retriever, hanging precariously from a chain on a rooftop, its body trembling with exhaustion. The chain was rusted, digging into the thin skin of its neck. The dog's ribs were painfully visible, its fur matted and patchy. Its wide eyes, filled with terror, seemed to plead for help even through the photo. A second message followed almost immediately. "Claire, It's Earl Jenkins' dog. I've already called the police, but they said it'll take time to get there. This poor thing has been hanging like this for hours. Please, can you do something?" Claire stared at the screen, her stomach churning with a mix of anger and dread. She swiped to the next photo. It was a close-up of the dog's face, its tongue hanging out, its breaths laboured. Her coffee mug sat untouched on the table as she began typing back, her hands trembling slightly with the urgency of the moment. "I'm on my way." With those words, Claire grabbed her jacket, stuffed her phone in her pocket, and stepped out into the bright Florida sun. She had no idea how this day would change her life, but she knew one thing: she couldn't ignore that dog's silent cry for help. The air was thick with tension as Claire Dawson approached the rundown house on Shoreline Road. The bright Florida sun highlighted every crack in the peeling paint and every warped shingle on the sagging roof. The home, standing in stark contrast to the pristine neighborhood around it, was a reflection of its owner, neglected, broken, and unwelcoming. A small group of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, their murmurs filling the space with a mix of concern and helplessness. Among them, Mrs. Fletcher stood wringing her hands, her face pale with worry. "Claire, thank goodness you're here," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice shaking. "It's been like this all morning. Poor thing's barely hanging on." Claire followed the direction of her pointing finger and felt a chill run down her spine. There it was, Shadow, the black Labrador retriever from the photos. The dog's thin, emaciated body dangled precariously from the rusted chain attached to the gutter of the roof. Its trembling legs barely scraped the shingles, and its wide, terrified eyes darted around as if searching for salvation. Claire's jaw tightened, her heart pounding. She had seen suffering before, on the streets, in crime scenes, but this was different. This wasn't just neglect. This was outright cruelty. The low hum of a radio drifted from inside the house, accompanied by the faint clinking of glass. Claire took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and marched toward the front door. She banged her fist against the weathered wood, the sound echoing through the still air. "Earl Jenkins!" she called, her voice sharp and commanding. "Open up!" For a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing Earl Jenkins in all his dishevelled glory. The man leaned heavily against the doorframe, a bottle of cheap whiskey dangling from one hand. His bloodshot eyes squinted against the sunlight, and the stench of alcohol wafted toward Claire. "What do you want?" he slurred, his tone a mix of annoyance and indifference. Claire wasted no time. "Your dog is hanging off the roof, Earl. It's dying. You need to do something." Earl glanced lazily towards the roof, then shrugged. "So what? It's just a dog." Claire felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "So what? It's suffering, Earl. That dog is hanging by a chain that's going to snap any second." Earl sneered, taking another swig from his bottle. "It's my property, my dog. I'll deal with it when I feel like it." Without another word, he slammed the door in her face. Claire turned back to the group of neighbors, her face set in a mask of determination. "Does anyone have a ladder?" she asked, her voice sharp with urgency. A young man stepped forward. "I've got one in my truck. Be right back." Within moments, a sturdy ladder was propped against the side of the house. Claire didn't hesitate. She climbed swiftly, her police training guiding her every movement. Years of chasing down criminals on rooftops hadn't left her, and for that she was grateful. As she reached the top, Shadow let out a weak whimper, his body trembling. The dog's wide eyes locked onto hers, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's okay, boy," she said softly, her voice steady and calm. "I'm here to help." The chain was rusted and tight, biting into the thin skin of Shadow's neck. Claire worked quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the clasp. The gutter creaked ominously under her weight, and the chain began to sway with each small movement. "Stay steady!" she shouted to the neighbors holding the ladder. "I need just a few more seconds." The chain gave a final groan as Claire managed to unhook it. Shadow collapsed into her arms, his frail body limp but alive. Carefully, she adjusted her grip, cradling the dog against her chest as she began her descent. When she reached the ground, the crowd erupted into cheers and relieved murmurs. Claire laid Shadow gently on the grass, her hands moving to check his breathing. His shallow breaths were steady, but his ribs rose and fell with difficulty. His wide, dark eyes stared up at her, filled with gratitude, despite his exhaustion. "You're okay now," Claire whispered, stroking his scarred head. "You're safe." Earl emerged from the house, his face twisted in anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked. Claire stood, her frame tall and imposing despite her age. "Saving a life, Earl," she said coolly. "Something you clearly don't care about." "You had no right," Earl began, but he faltered as Claire took a step toward him, her steely gaze cutting him off mid-sentence. "You want to try me, Earl? Go ahead. I've dealt with worse than you." Earl's mouth opened as if to retort, but he seemed to think better of it. With a growl, he retreated back into his house, slamming the door behind him. Claire turned back to the dog. Shadow's thin body trembled as he tried to sit up, but he was too weak. She gently scooped him into her arms, his head resting against her shoulder. His frailty struck her again, but there was something else now, something stronger. Shadow's tail gave the faintest wag, a sign of life and trust. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, tears brimming in her eyes. "Claire, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You can thank me by calling animal control," Claire replied. "This dog needs medical attention, and Earl needs to face the consequences." The crowd dispersed, but Claire's focus remained on Shadow. As she carried him toward her car, she felt a spark reignite within her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog. This was about doing what was right. Shadow let out a soft, weary sigh as Claire gently placed him in the back seat. She glanced at him one last time before shutting the door, a determination settling in her chest. "I've got you now," she murmured, "and I'm not letting you go." The wail of sirens pierced the humid air as 2 police cruisers arrived at Earl Jenkins' decrepit house. Their flashing lights painted the rundown property in shades of red and blue, a stark contrast to the morning sunlight. The small crowd of neighbors who had witnessed the dramatic rescue moments earlier remained on the sidewalk, murmuring anxiously as the officers stepped out of their vehicles. Claire Dawson, still cradling Shadow in her arms, turned to face the officers. The dog's frail body trembled against her chest, but his wide, dark eyes remained fixed on her, as though clinging to the safety she offered. For a moment she met his gaze, feeling a surge of protectiveness that surprised even her. "Ma'am, what's the situation here?" one officer asked, his stern expression softening slightly as he noticed the dog in Claire's arms. Claire gestured toward the house with her chin. "That man, Earl Jenkins, has been neglecting and abusing this dog. I have photos and witnesses who can confirm it. The poor thing was chained to the roof when I got here. If I hadn't cut him down, he'd be dead by now." The officer's face hardened. "And the owner? Is he inside?" Claire nodded. "He's been uncooperative and belligerent, and he's clearly intoxicated." Earl Jenkins, who had been watching from behind a tattered curtain, flung the door open, a scowl plastered across his face. "What's all this noise? You people got nothing better to do than harass me." The officer stepped forward. "Mr. Jenkins, we've received multiple reports of animal cruelty, and we're here to investigate." Earl snorted, waving his bottle dismissively. "It's just a dog. Don't you have real criminals to catch?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, step outside. Now!" When Earl didn't comply, the second officer moved in, taking him firmly by the arm and guiding him down the steps. Earl sputtered in protest, but the sight of the handcuffs being snapped around his wrists silenced him. The gathered neighbors murmured with approval as the officers escorted him to the squad car. "You can't do this! That's my property!" Earl shouted, his voice slurred and desperate. But no one seemed to care. One of the officers turned to Claire. "We'll take it from here, ma'am." Can you provide us with those photos and a statement? Claire handed over her phone, her movements careful so as not to jostle Shadow. The photos are all here, and I'm sure the neighbours can confirm what they've seen. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, her hands still trembling. I've got photos too, and I saw the whole thing. That man shouldn't be allowed near another animal ever again. The officer nodded, noting her statement before turning back to Claire. We'll make sure justice is served. Now, let's get that dog some help. The drive to Dr. Emily Harper's clinic was quiet, save for the soft whimpers of Shadow in the back seat. Claire glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her heart breaking at the sight. His thin body was curled into a tight ball, his breathing shallow and uneven. Every bump in the road made him flinch, but his eyes remained locked on Claire, as though silently pleading for reassurance. You're safe now, Shadow, she murmured. We'll get you fixed up. The small veterinary clinic sat tucked between rows of palm trees, its cheerful exterior a welcome contrast to the grim events of the morning. Dr. Emily Harper, a woman in her late 30s with kind green eyes and auburn hair pulled into a neat ponytail, was waiting at the door when Claire arrived. You must be Claire, she said, her voice warm but laced with concern. Bring him in. Claire followed Emily into the examination room, gently placing Shadow on the padded table. The dog let out a faint whine, his tail giving the slightest wag as Claire stroked his head. Emily began her examination, her practiced hands moving over Shadow's fragile frame. He's severely malnourished, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. His ribs are sticking out, and his skin is thin and scarred. There are signs of chronic neglect, probably months of insufficient food and water, and these wounds, she gestured to the small cuts and patches of missing fur on his back and sides. Some look fresh, likely from that chain. Others are older, but they've never healed properly. Claire felt her throat tighten. Will he be okay? Emily nodded, her expression softening. He's weak, but he's a fighter. With the right care, he has a good chance of recovery. First, we'll start with fluids to rehydrate him and treat these wounds to prevent infection. As Emily worked, Shadow's eyes stayed fixed on Claire. Despite the fear and pain etched into his expression, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Claire reached out and rested her hand on his paw. You're going to be okay, Shadow, she said softly. We'll get you through this. Emily paused, tilting her head. Shadow? Is that his name? Claire smiled faintly. It is now. Over the next hour, Emily and her assistants carefully tended to Shadow. They cleaned his wounds, started an IV for hydration, and applied a soothing balm to the raw patches of skin around his neck. Shadow whimpered occasionally, but he remained still, his trust in Claire unwavering. He's lucky you found him, Emily said as she finished bandaging one of his legs. Another day or two in those conditions, and he wouldn't have survived. Claire swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking in. She had spent so many years fighting for justice, but this felt different, personal. She looked at Shadow, now resting peacefully on the table, and felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in a long time, purpose. Can I stay with him for a while? Claire asked. Emily smiled. Of course, he'll need someone familiar around when he wakes up. Claire pulled a chair close to the table and sat, her hand gently stroking Shadow's head. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully take in the magnitude of what had happened. The cruelty, the rescue, the fragility of life balanced on the edge of hope and despair. Shadow had endured so much, but he had survived. As the sunlight streamed through the clinic's window, Claire leaned forward and whispered, We're not done yet, Shadow. This is just the beginning. The days following Shadow's rescue were filled with quiet determination and cautious optimism. Under the careful hands of Dr. Emily Harper and her team, Shadow's wounds began to heal, and his fragile body showed the first signs of strength returning. He was still painfully thin, his ribs protruding like ridges beneath his glossy black fur, but his eyes, once filled with fear and exhaustion, now held a faint glimmer of hope. Claire Dawson visited the clinic every day, bringing with her small treats and a soft voice that Shadow had begun to recognize. On the third day, as Claire sat beside his bed, reading softly from an old detective novel, Emily approached her with a clipboard in hand. "He's stable enough to leave," Emily said with a smile, "but he'll need a quiet, nurturing environment to continue recovering." Claire looked at Shadow, who was curled into a tight ball, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of her voice. She felt a pang of protectiveness that surprised even herself. "I'll take him," she said without hesitation. That afternoon, Shadow took his first steps into Claire's home. He moved cautiously, his legs still unsteady, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Claire had prepared a cozy corner of her living room with a soft blanket and a small bowl of water, but Shadow lingered near the door, his body tense. "It's okay, boy," Claire said softly, kneeling to his level. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Shadow took a tentative step forward, his nose brushing against her palm. Claire spent the next few days giving Shadow the space he needed to acclimate. She spoke to him in calm, reassuring tones, her movements slow and deliberate. Bit by bit, Shadow began to trust her. He followed her as she moved around the house, his tail wagging faintly when she knelt to pet him. Their first walk along the beach was tentative but transformative. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the sand, and the rhythmic crash of waves filled the air. Shadow stayed close to Claire, his ears flicking nervously at the distant shouts of children playing in the surf. Every so often, he would stop and look up at her, as though seeking reassurance. "You're doing great," Claire said, crouching to his level. She ran a hand gently along his back, and Shadow let out a soft sigh, his muscles relaxing slightly. They walked in silence for a while, the ocean breeze ruffling Claire's short grey hair and stirring Shadow's thin coat. For Claire, the walks became a kind of therapy, a time to reflect and breathe. For Shadow, they were a step toward freedom, a chance to reclaim a world that had once been filled with fear. But healing was never linear. Shadow's past trauma lingered like a shadow of its own, manifesting in moments of panic. One evening, as Claire was in the kitchen preparing dinner, a sudden clap of thunder rattled the windows. Shadow, who had been resting near her feet, bolted into the living room, his body trembling as he cowered beneath the coffee table. Claire set down the knife and wiped her hands, her heart breaking at the sight of him. She knelt beside the table, speaking softly. "It's okay, Shadow. It's just a storm. You're safe." It took nearly an hour, but Shadow eventually crept out, his tail tucked between his legs. Claire sat with him on the floor, her hand resting on his back as the storm raged outside. "We'll get through this," she whispered. Shadow's fear of being alone was another hurdle. On the rare occasions when Claire had to leave the house, Shadow paced restlessly, his soft whimpers filling the empty space. One day she returned to find him curled in a corner, his eyes wide with anxiety. Claire knelt beside him, stroking his head. "I'm here now," she said, "and I'll always come back." Determined to help him feel more secure, Claire began leaving for short periods and gradually increasing the time. She left an old shirt of hers near his bed, her scent a comfort in her absence. Slowly, Shadow began to trust that she would always return. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. Shadow's physical health improved, his coat growing shinier, his gait more confident. But it was the small, unspoken moments that strengthened their connection. The way Shadow rested his head on Claire's lap during their quiet evenings, the way Claire's voice softened when she spoke to him, the way they both seemed to find solace in each other's company. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Claire found herself speaking aloud. "You know, Shadow," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I didn't realize how lonely I'd been until you came along. Shadow lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. His tail gave a faint wag, as though he understood. "You've been through so much," Claire continued, "but you're still here, and you've reminded me that I'm still here too." Their routines settled into something that felt like healing. Morning walks along the beach, quiet afternoons tending the garden, evenings curled up together as the sounds of the waves filled the room. Claire found herself smiling more often, her loneliness replaced by a sense of purpose, and Shadow, once a terrified, broken soul, began to embody the resilience of his namesake, finding light even in the darkest corners. By the end of the month, Claire realized that Shadow had done more than recover. He had brought her back to life too. The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the bright Florida sky, its pale stone facade reflecting the morning sunlight. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet murmurs, punctuated by the shuffle of papers and the occasional sharp click of heels on polished floors. Claire Dawson sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Though her face remained calm, her mind raced as she replayed the events that had brought her here. Next to her sat Mrs. Fletcher, her steadfast neighbor, who had been a crucial witness in the case. Behind them, a few other neighbors from Shoreline Road had come to lend their support. Despite their small numbers, their presence felt like a collective stand against the cruelty they had all witnessed. At the defendant's table sat Earl Jenkins, looking far less defiant than the day Claire had rescued Shadow from his clutches. His disheveled appearance and sullen demeanor reflected a man cornered by his own actions. A court-appointed attorney whispered something in his ear, but Earl barely seemed to register it, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the table before him. The prosecutor, a sharp and confident woman in her 40s, began to outline the case with precision. She presented the evidence Claire had provided, the photos of Shadow dangling from the roof, the detailed account of the rescue, and the testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed Earl's neglect. The prosecutor didn't hold back, her words cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Earl Jenkins subjected this dog to prolonged and inhumane conditions," she said firmly, gesturing toward the photos displayed on the screen. "This wasn't just neglect, it was deliberate cruelty. And thanks to the courage of Miss Dawson and the concerned neighbors, this animal's suffering was brought to an end." Claire's turn to testify came next. As she took the stand, her gaze briefly met Earl's. He looked away, his defiance replaced by a flicker of discomfort. Claire inhaled deeply, steadying herself, and began to recount the events of that fateful day. "I saw the dog hanging from the roof by a chain," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He was weak, terrified, and close to death. I knew if I didn't act, he wouldn't survive." She detailed the confrontation with Earl, the rescue itself, and the condition Shadow was in when she brought him to the veterinarian. As she spoke, she glanced at the judge and jury, ensuring her words carried the weight of truth. When asked why she intervened, Claire paused, her expression softening. Because it was the right thing to do. That dog deserved better. All animals do. Mrs. Fletcher followed Claire's testimony, her voice trembling but resolute. She described the months of neglect she had witnessed, Earl's callous attitude toward Shadow, and the day she finally called Claire for help. Her account painted a clear picture of Earl's pattern of abuse, leaving little room for doubt. Earl's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was simply going through hard times, and that his actions were misunderstood. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the defense's case fell apart under the weight of the truth. The prosecutor concluded her argument with a pointed statement. This case isn't just about a dog. It's about sending a message that cruelty in any form will not be tolerated. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts of animal cruelty. Earl Jenkins was sentenced to a substantial fine community service at a local animal shelter and, most importantly, a lifetime ban on owning any animals. The judge's gavel struck the sound block with a decisive thud, signaling the end of the trial. As the courtroom emptied, Claire remained seated for a moment, letting the verdict sink in. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, knowing that justice had been served. Earl Jenkins would never have the chance to harm another animal. But as she thought of Shadow, now resting peacefully at her home, she knew their journey was far from over. Mrs. Fletcher placed a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "You gave Shadow a voice." Claire smiled faintly. "We all did." The drive home was quiet, the sense of closure settling over Claire like a warm blanket. When she walked through her front door, Shadow was there to greet her, his tail wagging faintly, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. He was still skittish, still healing, but each day brought a little more trust, a little more hope. Claire knelt down, running a hand over his glossy coat. "It's over, Shadow," she said softly. "He can't hurt you, or anyone else, ever again." Shadow leaned into her touch, his warm, steady presence a reminder of why she had fought so hard. For Claire, the courtroom victory was only one chapter of their story. The real work, helping Shadow fully heal and rediscover the joy he deserved, was still ahead. But as she sat with him in the quiet comfort of her home, she knew they would face it together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over Clearwater Beach as Claire Dawson watched Shadow chase after a stick she'd thrown. His glossy black coat shimmered in the fading light, and his once frail frame now moved with strength and grace. It had been months since she first rescued him, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Shadow still carried traces of his past. He flinched at sudden noises and remained wary of strangers, but his resilience shone through in his wagging tail and the way he looked at Claire with trust and affection. That afternoon, as they walked back towards the house, Claire noticed a car parked in her driveway. A young couple stood beside it, waving as she approached. Claire recognized them immediately, Megan and Ryan Cooper, a pair she'd met through the local animal shelter. They had heard about Shadow's story and expressed interest in adopting him. Though Claire was initially hesitant, their warmth and genuine love for animals had won her over. "Hi, Claire," Megan said, her voice cheerful yet soft. She crouched down to greet Shadow, holding out her hand for him to sniff. "Hi there, Shadow. You remember us, don't you?" Shadow tilted his head, his tail wagging cautiously. Megan let him approach on his own terms, her patience a testament to her understanding of rescued animals. Ryan stood nearby, his steady presence offering quiet support. "Thanks for coming," Claire said, her voice steady, despite the mix of emotions bubbling inside her. "He's come such a long way, but I think you two might be exactly what he needs next." Ryan smiled. "We've been preparing for this day. Our home is ready for him, and we can't wait to make him part of our family." Inside, Claire invited them to sit, while Shadow observed from a safe distance. She handed Megan a folder filled with information, Shadow's medical records, his favorite toys, and notes about his routines and triggers. "He's a special boy," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's been through so much, but he has so much love to give. I think he'll thrive with you." Megan nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Claire, for saving him and for trusting us with him." Claire looked at Shadow, who had slowly crept closer to Megan and Ryan. His nose twitched as he sniffed Ryan's hand, then gave a small, tentative wag of his tail. It was enough to confirm what Claire already knew. Shadow was ready. The next day, under the glow of a breathtaking sunset, Claire prepared to say goodbye. Megan and Ryan stood by their car, the trunk open to reveal a cozy bed and a bag of Shadow's favorite treats. Shadow stood beside Claire, his leash loose in her hand. Claire knelt down, her knees pressing into the cool grass. She ran a hand along Shadow's back, her fingers tracing the glossy fur that had once been matted and scarred. "You're going to be so happy," she whispered. "They're going to love you, and you deserve every bit of it." Shadow leaned into her touch, his warm brown eyes locking onto hers. Slowly he lifted his head and licked her hand, his way of saying thank you. Claire felt a lump rise in her throat but swallowed it back. "You're a good boy, Shadow. The best boy." Megan stepped forward and gently took the leash. "We'll take great care of him, Claire," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "We'll send updates, I promise." Claire nodded, blinking back tears. That would mean the world to me. As Megan and Ryan guided Shadow into the car, Claire stood back, her arms crossed over her chest. She watched as Shadow climbed into the back seat, his tail wagging faintly as he settled onto the soft bed. Megan shut the door and waved as they pulled out of the driveway. Shadow turned to look out the window, his eyes meeting Claire's one last time. In that moment, she felt a surge of gratitude, not for what she had done for him, but for what he had done for her. "Goodbye, Shadow," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the car driving away. As the car disappeared down the road, Claire stood in the quiet of her yard, the sunset casting long shadows across the ground. The house behind her felt emptier, but her heart felt full. Shadow had found his forever home, and though she would miss him, she knew she had given him the best chance at a new life. Turning toward the horizon, Claire smiled softly. The journey she and Shadow had shared was coming to an end, but its impact would last forever. The gentle sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air as Claire Dawson adjusted the brim of her sun hat. The familiar sight of Clearwater Beach stretched before her, golden sands glowing under the afternoon sun. She had walked this shoreline many times, but today felt special. Her heart beat with a quiet anticipation. In the distance, she spotted a figure waving enthusiastically. Megan and Ryan Cooper were walking toward her, their smiles bright and welcoming. But what made Claire's heart skip a beat was the sight of Shadow bounding alongside them, his black coat shimmering in the sunlight, his tail wagging furiously. "Shadow!" Claire called, her voice breaking with emotion. The Labrador's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. Without hesitation, he bolted toward her, his paws kicking up sand as he sprinted across the beach. When he reached her, he leapt into her arms, nearly knocking her over. His warm tongue licked her face as his tail thumped against her legs. Claire laughed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh, I've missed you, boy," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. As Megan and Ryan approached, they smiled at the sight of the reunion. "He's been so excited," Megan said. "It's like he knew we were coming to see you." Claire looked up, wiping her eyes. "Thank you for bringing him. He looks so happy." "And he's doing great," Ryan added. "He loves running on the beach, playing fetch, and even swimming. He's truly thriving." Shadow darted away for a moment, chasing a seagull before circling back to Claire, his joyful energy infectious. As Claire watched him, her chest swelled with pride and peace. The dog that had once been broken, frail and terrified, was now a picture of health and happiness. He was living the life he deserved, a life filled with love. As the afternoon wore on, the group sat together on a blanket, watching Shadow chase the waves. Claire felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Shadow's transformation had been remarkable, but it wasn't just about the dog. Their journey together had healed a part of her too. She had rediscovered her strength, her purpose, and the profound impact of compassion. When it was time for Megan and Ryan to leave, Shadow hesitated by the car, looking back at Claire with his soulful brown eyes. She knelt down, stroking his head one last time. "You'll always have a place in my heart, Shadow," she said softly. "Be good for them. You've got the best family now." Shadow licked her hand, as if to say he understood, then hopped into the car. As Megan and Ryan waved goodbye, Claire stood on the beach, watching until the car disappeared from sight. The waves continued their timeless rhythm, and Claire felt a sense of closure. Shadow's story is a testament to the boundless power of compassion, the importance of second chances, and the grace of God's love. through patience and kindness, even the deepest wounds can be healed. Let this story remind us that we are called to care for all of God's creations, big and small. If this story touched your heart, share it with others. Together, we can spread hope, kindness, and love to every animal and every person who needs it. May God bless you and guide you to be a light in the lives of others. The night was bitter, the alley reeked of decay. A man in a dark coat stood by a dumpster, holding a small, trembling puppy in his rough hands. No hesitation, no second thoughts. He tossed her inside like a piece of trash and walked away without looking back. Hours passed. The cold seeped into her tiny bones. Hunger gnawed at her frail body. Her breathing grew shallow. Then, footsteps. The dumpster lid creaked open. A homeless man peered in. His tired eyes met hers. A moment of silence, then he shut the lid and walked away. And so the little tail that once wagged with hope began to slow. But fate wasn't finished just yet. The city was nameless, faceless, a place where people passed each other without a second glance, where lives slipped through the cracks unnoticed. It was winter, and the streets were lined with the ghosts of discarded things, broken furniture, abandoned bicycles, crumpled newspapers, and, on this particular night, a dying puppy. She had been nothing more than a nuisance, an inconvenience to the man who had owned her. A weak, sickly thing with ribs poking through her matted fur, eyes too large for her tiny head, and a whimper so soft it could barely be heard over the distant hum of traffic. Her owner, a burly man with calloused hands and a heart as cold as the December wind, had grown tired of her. He had bought her on impulse, expecting a strong, playful pup, but instead he got this fragile, shivering creature that couldn't even stand up straight without collapsing. She was sick, worthless, and so, without hesitation, he had taken her to a back alley behind a rundown apartment complex, lifting the dumpster lid with one hand and gripping her scruff with the other. She was too weak to struggle. There was no fight left in her. She dangled in his grasp, eyes half-lidded, barely breathing. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed her inside. She landed with a sickening thud against a pile of rotting food scraps and torn plastic bags. The lid slammed shut, and the man walked away, never once looking back. The darkness inside the dumpster was absolute. The stench of decay clawed at her nostrils, and the icy metal pressed against her frail body like a coffin lid. She tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't obey. She was too cold, too weak. Her tiny stomach cramped from hunger, but there was no food to be found here, only mouldy bread and things that smelled too foul to be touched. Minutes passed, maybe hours. She didn't know. Time blurred into a haze of pain and exhaustion. Then light. He stared at her. She met his gaze with empty, defeated eyes. Then he shut the lid. The darkness returned. She was alone again. Later, another set of hands lifted the lid. A different man, also homeless, also worn down by the brutal indifference of the world. He squinted at her, grunted, then let the lid fall with a clang. Again, alone. No one wanted her. The cold wrapped around her like an unforgiving embrace, and she let herself sink deeper into it. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat weakened. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe she was meant to disappear, just another forgotten thing in a city that never looked back. Then, a third time, the lid creaked open. Daniel wasn't looking for anything when he walked through the alley that night. He never was. Life had long since stopped offering him gifts. His coat was threadbare, barely enough to keep out the wind. His stomach ached from hunger, but he had learned to live with that. He had been homeless for years, and he knew better than to expect kindness from this world. He was about to pass the dumpster when something caught his eye. A faint, desperate movement. A tiny tail barely wagging. He hesitated. He had seen plenty of things in the trash, broken dolls, torn clothes, forgotten remnants of people's lives. But this was different. Cautiously, he lifted the lid. The smell hit him first. Rot, garbage, death. But beneath all that, curled up like a crumpled leaf, was the smallest, weakest puppy he had ever seen. For a moment he just stared. And yet her tail wagged. Barely, weakly, but it wagged. Daniel's throat tightened. He should walk away. He knew that. He could barely feed himself. What could he possibly do for this dog? But then the puppy opened her eyes. Big, round, pain-filled eyes that locked onto his. And in them, Daniel saw something he recognized too well. Not just suffering, not just fear, but the quiet, fragile hope of something that had been abandoned too many times, but still, somehow, wanted to live. Daniel exhaled shakily. Without thinking, he reached inside, hands closing gently around the trembling, fragile body. She was so light, so small, so cold. He cradled her against his chest, feeling the faintest, weakest heartbeat flutter against his palm. She shouldn't have lasted this long. She shouldn't have survived the cold, the hunger, the abandonment. But somehow she had. And Daniel, who had nothing, who had no one, knew in that moment that he couldn't let her die. With slow, careful steps, he turned away from the dumpster and walked back into the night. He didn't know how he would keep her warm. He didn't know how he would feed her. But for the first time in a long time, he had found something worth trying for. And in his arms, the tiny tail wagged just a little bit stronger. Daniel walked through the empty streets, the weight of the tiny puppy pressed against his chest. The city was vast and uncaring, its towering buildings looming above him, windows dark and hollow. It was late, and most of the world had already retreated indoors, seeking warmth behind locked doors and drawn curtains. But for Daniel, there was no door to unlock, no home to return to, only the cold pavement beneath his feet and the uncertain night stretching before him. The puppy barely stirred. She was weak, her body limp in his arms, but every so often he felt the faintest movement, a twitch of her paw, a shuddering breath, the softest flick of her tiny tail. She was still alive, clinging to life with a determination that struck something deep inside him. He had seen too many things die on these streets, people, animals, dreams, but this one, she was still fighting. When he reached his usual sleeping spot, a narrow alleyway wedged between an abandoned storefront and an old laundromat, he carefully set her down on the makeshift bedding of tattered blankets and worn-out cardboard. The alley was a small sanctuary, shielded from the worst of the wind, though the chill still crept in through the cracks. He sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth before reaching for the old plastic bottle he kept beside him. He had filled it earlier from a public fountain, the water icy from the winter air. He poured a small amount into his palm, watching as the liquid glistened under the weak light. Gently, he cupped it over her injured leg, trying to clean away the grime. The moment the cold water touched her skin, the puppy let out a sharp whimper, her tiny body jerking in pain. Daniel froze. She whimpered again, but she didn't bite or pull away. Instead, she let him continue, her trust implicit, despite the pain. Daniel worked carefully, doing his best with the little he had. He tore a piece of an old shirt, dampening it to gently wipe away the dirt. The wound was bad, but not infected, at least not yet. He had seen wounds like this before, though never on something so small, so fragile. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, running a tired hand through his unkempt hair. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. There was nothing to eat anyway. His gaze fell on the puppy once more. She was curled up, her small body trembling from exhaustion, but her breathing was steady. She was still here. The question pressed against his mind, heavy and unavoidable. What was he supposed to do now? He could take her to the nearest animal shelter in the morning. Maybe they would take her. Maybe they wouldn't. He had heard stories, shelters overcrowded, underfunded, forced to turn away the sickest and weakest ones. And even if they did accept her, what kind of future would she have? A puppy as weak as this. Would they even bother trying to save her? Or would they decide it was kinder to put her down? Daniel clenched his jaw, trying to push away the thought. He didn't want to think about that. Then there was the other option. He could keep her. The absurdity of it nearly made him laugh. He could barely take care of himself. What business did he have taking care of a dog? He had no home, no steady food, no money for medicine if she needed it. He lived off scraps and whatever kindness he could scavenge from strangers. A puppy would be another mouth to feed, another life to worry about. And yet, he looked at her again. He had never been needed before, not really. The world had long since discarded him, the same way her owner had discarded her. But now there was something small, something fragile, something alive that needed him. Daniel exhaled slowly, the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He would try. Somehow, some way he would try. The wind howled through the alley, and Daniel pulled his thin coat tighter around himself before carefully wrapping a piece of blanket around the puppy. He curled up beside her, shielding her from the worst of the cold, his own body aching from the long day. She let out a small sigh, nestling against him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so completely alone. The days that followed were brutal. Winter had tightened its grip on the city, filling the air with an unforgiving chill that seeped into every crack, every alleyway, every exposed piece of flesh. Daniel had endured many winters on the streets, but this one felt different, harsher, more relentless. Or maybe, for the first time in a long time, he had something to lose. Maggie was still weak. Though she was eating the scraps Daniel shared with her, it wasn't enough. He had little food for himself, and what little he had, he gave to her. Stale bread, half-eaten sandwiches fished from dumpsters, the occasional leftovers from a generous passer-by. It wasn't much, but she never refused it, licking his fingers after each meal as if thanking him. But it wasn't just the hunger that worried him, it was the cold. He had tried to keep her warm, holding her close, shielding her from the worst of the wind, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed real warmth, real shelter, and Daniel had none to give. As the days stretched on, he found himself growing weaker too. Hunger gnawed at him, exhaustion clung to his limbs, and the weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. Every moment spent watching over Maggie was a moment spent questioning whether he had made a mistake. He had nothing, no home, no job, no security. What made him think he could keep this dog alive? Still, he couldn't let her go. On the fourth day, when Maggie's fever had worsened and her body felt unnaturally hot beneath his fingers, Daniel knew he needed help. There was only one place he could turn to. Jake's diner sat at the edge of the city's busier streets, nestled between an old laundromat and a rundown convenience store. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and more importantly, Jake, the owner, was one of the few people who hadn't treated Daniel like he was invisible. But this time Daniel wasn't coming for himself, he was coming for Maggie. With the puppy wrapped tightly in his coat, he made his way toward the diner, his steps slow and unsteady. The sidewalks were lined with people, bundled in thick coats and scarves, rushing past him without a glance. He could feel their unspoken judgment, the way they averted their eyes as if his presence alone was an inconvenience. He was used to it. When he finally reached the diner, he hesitated. The warm glow of the neon "Open" sign flickered above him, casting light against the wet pavement. Inside, the scent of coffee and freshly grilled food filled the air, a painful reminder of how long it had been since he had eaten a real meal. But he wasn't here for himself. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The warmth hit him instantly, the contrast so jarring that Maggie whimpered against his chest. The few patrons inside barely glanced up. Just another homeless man stepping in from the cold. Jake, standing behind the counter, noticed him immediately. "Daniel," Jake said, his deep voice carrying both familiarity and mild surprise. He wiped his hands on a rag, stepping closer. "Haven't seen you in a while. You all right?" Daniel nodded hesitantly. I need help." Jake's gaze shifted to the small bundle in Daniel's arms. He frowned, setting the rag down and leaning in slightly. "What's that you got there?" Daniel carefully unwrapped his coat, revealing Maggie's frail body. The puppy barely moved, her tiny chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. Jake exhaled sharply. "Damn," he muttered. "She doesn't look good." Daniel swallowed hard. "I found her. She was dumped. I've been trying to take care of her, but she's not getting better. I don't know what to do." For a moment, Jake didn't say anything. He just looked at Maggie, then at Daniel, really looked at him. He saw the exhaustion, the worry, the desperation in his eyes. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the back. Daniel's heart pounded. Had he said too much? Was Jake about to throw him out? But when Jake returned, he wasn't empty-handed. He carried a small blanket, a plastic container filled with what looked like bits of chicken and rice, and a bottle of water. "Here," Jake said gruffly, setting them down on the counter. "She needs warmth, food, maybe a vet, but I know you can't afford that." He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I can ask around, see if anyone knows someone willing to take a look at her. No promises, but it's something." Daniel stared at him, stunned. Thank you, really." Jake waved him off. "Just keep her alive, all right?" Daniel nodded, carefully wrapping Maggie in the blanket. The food smelled heavenly, and he didn't even realize how hungry he was until his stomach clenched in response. But he didn't eat. This was for her. He dipped his fingers into the container, scooping up a small piece of chicken and holding it near Maggie's nose. She barely reacted at first, too weak to acknowledge it, but after a few agonizing seconds, her small pink tongue flicked out, tasting the food. Relief flooded Daniel's chest. She was still fighting. Jake watched in silence before sighing. "You staying under the bridge again?" Jake didn't look satisfied with the answer, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned on the counter, his voice quieter now. "Look, I know you don't like taking handouts, but you should come back here if she gets worse, or if you need more food for her. I can't do much, but I can at least do that." "Thank you," he said again, the words barely above a whisper. Jake only nodded. As Daniel left the diner, Maggie still cradled in his arms, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She wasn't out of danger yet. She was still weak, still burning with fever, and he had no idea how he was going to get her the help she truly needed. But for the first time since he had found her in that dumpster, he didn't feel completely alone. The city never slept, but it had a way of making those who lived in its shadows feel invisible. Daniel had grown accustomed to blending into the background, to the way people rushed past him with their heads down, pretending he didn't exist. He had learned long ago that asking for help rarely led to anything but disappointment, and so he had stopped asking altogether. But now, with Maggie growing weaker in his arms, he had no choice. He had to do something, anything, to keep her alive. The fever had not broken. Despite the food Jake had given him and the extra warmth of the blanket, Maggie's tiny body was still burning up. She barely moved, and when she did, it was only to press herself closer to him, as if she knew he was the only thing keeping her safe. Daniel had seen enough sickness in his years on the streets to know that if she didn't get real help soon, she wouldn't make it. But where could he go? Animal clinics weren't exactly welcoming to a man like him. The shelters were overcrowded, and he had no money to pay for a vet. He was running out of options, and time was slipping away. It was then, as he wandered the streets aimlessly, lost in thought, that he heard the sound of voices, gentle, patient, familiar. He turned a corner and found himself in a small park near the edge of the city. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass, surrounded by worn-out benches and a few trees struggling to survive the winter. A group of people had gathered near a folding table covered in stacks of clothes, blankets, and paper cups of steaming soup. A woman stood behind the table, handing out warm jackets to a line of homeless men and women who had come seeking relief from the cold. Daniel knew her, though only by reputation. She was one of the few social workers in the city who genuinely seemed to care about the people she helped. She came here often, distributing supplies, offering kind words, and treating the forgotten with a dignity they rarely received elsewhere. Daniel had never spoken to her directly. He had always kept his distance, not out of distrust, but because he wasn't the kind of person who accepted charity easily. He had long since learned that kindness often came with a price, and he had no illusions about being anyone's project. But now, with Maggie weak in his arms, he found himself hesitating at the edge of the park, watching as Emily moved from person to person, offering comfort where she could. He didn't want to ask for help, but he had to. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. Emily was speaking to an older man when she noticed him approaching. She offered a warm smile, though there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had seen him before, even if they had never spoken. "Daniel, right?" she said, her voice kind but not patronizing. "I think I've seen you around a few times." He nodded, but said nothing. His throat felt tight, and for a moment he considered turning around and leaving. But then Maggie whimpered softly in his arms, and all his hesitation melted away. Emily's eyes dropped to the small bundle in his coat, and her expression immediately shifted from polite warmth to concern. "Oh, my God," she murmured, stepping closer. "Is that a puppy?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I found her," he said, his voice rough from days of little sleep. "Someone dumped her in a dumpster. She's sick. I've been trying to help her, but—" He trailed off, unsure of how to put into words the desperation clawing at his chest. Emily didn't hesitate. She reached out gently, not to take Maggie from him, but just to touch her fur, as if gauging how bad things really were. Her brows furrowed. "She's burning up," she said. "She needs medical attention, Daniel. Has she seen a vet?" He shook his head. "I don't have money for that." Emily was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she took a deep breath. "My husband, Liam, is a vet," she said. "He runs a clinic not too far from here. If you let me, I can take her to him. He can check her out, make sure she gets the care she needs." Daniel stiffened. The idea of handing Maggie over to someone else, even someone as well-meaning as Emily, made his stomach twist. He had fought to keep her alive this long. What if they took her from him? What if they decided he wasn't good enough to care for her? He had nothing, no home, no stability, no way to guarantee he could give her the life she deserved. And yet, she was all he had. The thought of losing her, after everything, was unbearable. Emily seemed to sense his hesitation. She met his gaze, steady and understanding. "I'm not trying to take her away from you," she said gently. "But she's sick, Daniel. And if she doesn't get help soon, she won't make it, you know that." He did know that. That was the worst part. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled shakily and gave a small nod. "All right," he whispered, "but I'm coming with her." Emily smiled, relief washing over her features. "Of course." She reached for her phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, a car pulled up to the curb, a modest sedan, slightly worn but well kept. Emily opened the passenger door and gestured for him to get in. Daniel hesitated again. It had been years since he had been inside a car, since he had allowed himself to accept a kindness like this. But Maggie stirred weakly in his arms, and he knew there was no other choice. Carefully, he climbed inside, cradling her against his chest as Emily slid into the driver's seat. As they pulled away from the park, Daniel glanced down at the fragile creature in his arms. He had done everything he could. Now, for the first time, Maggie's life was in someone else's hands, and he could only hope he had made the right choice. The clinic was warm, a stark contrast to the cold streets Daniel had come to know as home. The moment they stepped inside, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nose, mingling with the faint aroma of dog food and clean linens. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past patients, dogs, cats, even a few birds, all captured in moments of health and happiness. It was the kind of place meant to heal, to restore what was broken. And yet, Daniel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling twisting in his gut. Liam Carter, Emily's husband, and the clinic's head veterinarian, was already waiting for them. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, but with a calm presence that immediately put both animals and people at ease. He didn't ask questions when he saw Daniel step inside, only gave a small nod and gestured toward one of the examination rooms. Daniel hesitated, glancing down at Maggie. She was still nestled in his coat, her small body limp against his chest. She hadn't stirred much since they'd left the park, but her breathing, though shallow, was steady. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, a sign of the fever still burning through her frail frame. "Lay her down here," Liam instructed, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. Daniel did as he was told, gently unwrapping the coat and placing Maggie on the padded examination table. She let out a faint whimper, her tiny legs twitching as she tried to curl into herself. "She's dehydrated," he said after a moment. "Malnourished, obviously, but the biggest concern is her leg." He carefully lifted her injured paw, inspecting the swollen joint. "It's not broken, but it's badly sprained. Looks like she's been walking on it for too long without any real rest." Daniel swallowed hard. "Can you fix it?" Liam nodded. "She needs fluids, antibiotics for the fever, and a proper diet to get her strength back. I'll wrap the leg to keep her from putting too much pressure on it. But she needs time to heal. And she needs warmth." Warmth. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had done everything he could, but warmth was the one thing he couldn't always guarantee. Even the thickest blanket couldn't keep out the winter wind when you had no walls to hold it back. "How long does she need to stay here?" he asked, his voice tight. "A few days at least," Liam said. "I want to monitor her fever and make sure she's strong enough to eat on her own." Daniel stiffened. A few days. He had expected that answer, but hearing it aloud made his stomach knot. The idea of leaving Maggie in someone else's care, even someone like Liam, felt wrong. As if sensing his unease, Emily stepped forward. "She'll be safe here, Daniel," she said gently, "and you can come visit her any time." He hesitated. He didn't like the idea of being without her, but more than that, he didn't like the thought of her waking up alone in an unfamiliar place, scared and wondering where he had gone. But this was for her. He had to remind himself of that. With a reluctant nod, he took one last look at Maggie before stepping back. "I'll be back," he murmured, mostly to himself. Then, with heavy steps, he turned and walked out of the clinic. The wait. The next few days were some of the longest Daniel had ever endured. Without Maggie, the city felt even colder, the nights even longer. He still went to Jake's diner when he could, still found the warmest spots to sleep, but everything felt different now. Every morning as soon as the clinic opened, he was there. Emily would let him in, offering him coffee he rarely drank, and he would sit in the corner of the examination room while Liam checked Maggie's progress. And little by little she got better. Her fever broke on the second day. By the third, she was eating small portions of food without coaxing. On the fourth day, she even managed to lift her head when she heard his voice. "She's a fighter," Liam remarked, watching as Maggie licked a drop of water from his fingertips. "A little longer, and she'll be back on her feet." Daniel felt a flicker of something in his chest. Relief, maybe, or hope. But it wasn't until the fifth day that he realized just how much Maggie had been waiting for him, too. The reunion. When he arrived that morning, Emily greeted him with a knowing smile. "Go on in," she said, gesturing toward the back. "I think someone's been waiting for you." Daniel frowned, but didn't question it. He made his way down the now familiar hallway, stepping into the examination room where Maggie was resting. The moment he walked in, her ears perked up. Then, before he could react, she moved. It wasn't graceful. Her bandaged leg wobbled beneath her, and she nearly stumbled off the edge of the small cot. But there was no mistaking the excitement in her little body. Her tail thumped wildly against the blanket, her entire frame trembling with effort, and then, with more determination than strength, she leapt. Daniel barely had time to catch her as she hurled herself into his arms, her small tongue licking at his chin, her whimpers filled with a joy so pure it made his chest ache. "Whoa," he muttered, steadying her carefully. "Easy there, kid." But Maggie didn't care. She buried herself against him, pressing as close as she could, as if making sure he was real. Daniel felt something tighten in his throat. He had told himself that she would be fine without him, that she would heal and move on, that maybe, just maybe, She would be better off in someone else's care. But now, with her small body trembling in his arms, he knew the truth. She needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed her just as much. Liam, who had been watching from the doorway, let out a low whistle. "I'd say that settles it," he said, crossing his arms. "She's already decided where she belongs." Daniel looked down at Maggie, who had tucked herself beneath his coat, her tiny tail still wagging. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if he could keep her, if the streets would ever be safe enough for both of them. But as she sighed contentedly in his arms, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting her go. Daniel had spent years believing that life had no second chances. The city had taught him that, had ground the lesson into his bones with every cold night spent on the streets, with every door slammed in his face, with every person who had looked past him as if he weren't even there. But now, as he sat in the small back room of Jake's diner, Maggie curled up at his feet, warm and safe, he found himself daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. It had started with Emily. After seeing the way Maggie had fought to be with him, after watching the way he had cared for her with nothing but scraps and determination, she had made a decision. One morning, after Daniel had arrived at the clinic to check on Maggie, she pulled him aside. "Daniel," she said gently, "I want to help you." He had stiffened at that. Help had always come with conditions, with expectations, with the kind of pity that left a bitter taste in his mouth. But Emily wasn't looking at him like that. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering something else, something real. "You've taken care of Maggie when no one else would," she continued. "But you can't keep living on the streets. You know that. And neither can she." He didn't argue. He knew she was right. "I talked to Jake," she went on, "and he's willing to give you a job. Just part-time for now, helping out in the kitchen. It's not much, but it's something. And there's a shelter nearby that has space. It's not permanent, but it's warm, and they allow dogs." Daniel had just stared at her, the words sinking in slowly, feeling too big to fit inside his chest. A job, a place to sleep, things he hadn't had in years, things he had stopped believing were possible. He glanced down at Maggie, who was nuzzling against his leg, blissfully unaware of the conversation happening above her. He thought about the nights he had spent curled around her in the cold, the way she had clung to him in the clinic as if he was the only thing keeping her anchored. He wasn't just making this choice for himself. "Okay," he had said, the word quiet but firm. "I'll do it." The first day at the diner was strange. Daniel wasn't used to being inside for so long. He wasn't used to the steady hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the warmth of a heater that never cut out in the middle of the night. The last time he had held a job had been so long ago that it felt like another lifetime, a memory belonging to someone else entirely. Jake didn't say much when Daniel showed up that morning, wearing the clothes Emily had given him, a simple, clean shirt, and a second-hand jacket that actually fit. He just nodded and handed him an apron. "Dish station's back there," Jake said, jerking his thumb towards the kitchen. "It's not glamorous, but it's work. You think you can handle that?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I can handle it." And so he started. The first few hours were a blur of hot water, stacks of plates, and the ever-present scent of coffee and grease. His hands, rough from years of cold, grew red from the constant scrubbing, but he didn't complain. He worked quietly, methodically, forcing himself to ignore the small voice in the back of his mind that kept whispering that this wouldn't last, that something would go wrong, that people like him weren't meant to have things like this. But nothing went wrong. Jake didn't watch him like he was waiting for him to fail. The other employees barely gave him a second glance, treating him like any other new worker trying to find his rhythm. And at the end of the shift, when Daniel hesitantly approached Jake to ask if he had done all right, the older man just snorted. "You didn't break anything," he said, "and you didn't quit halfway through. That's better than half the guys I've hired." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Come back tomorrow," Jake added gruffly, turning away before Daniel could see whatever emotion flickered across his face. same time. Maggie waited for him at the shelter that night, her tail wagging the moment he stepped through the doors. The place was small, just a single room with a cot in the corner and a heater that rattled when it kicked on. But to Daniel, it was more than enough. It was a roof. It was warmth. It was somewhere to come back to. Maggie had her own little bed now, just an old cushion someone had donated, but she seemed to love it. Still, she rarely used it, preferring instead to curl up beside him as soon as he lay down, pressing herself against his side, the way she always had. "You comfortable, kid?" Daniel murmured, scratching behind her ear. Maggie let out a soft sigh, content. Daniel closed his eyes, listening to the steady hum of the heater, feeling the gentle rise and fall of Maggie's breathing against him. For the first time in a long time, he felt something settle inside him, something like peace. The days passed, turning into weeks. Daniel kept working at the diner, his hands growing accustomed to the rhythm of it, to the weight of dishes, to the sound of his name being called without it carrying an edge of disdain. He got to know the regulars, not well, but enough to recognize faces, to learn who liked their coffee black and who always asked for extra napkins. And slowly, cautiously, he started to believe that maybe this was real. Emily checked in on him often, not in a way that felt suffocating, but in a way that reminded him that someone still cared. Liam called once to ask about Maggie, to remind Daniel to bring her in for a checkup, to offer help if he ever needed it. Jake didn't say much, but sometimes, at the end of a shift, he'd slide an extra sandwich across the counter before Daniel could leave. "For the dog," he'd say, gruff as ever, as if that made it less of a kindness. And Maggie was thriving. Her leg had healed, and she had more energy now, bounding through the small shelter room like it was the greatest place in the world. She greeted Daniel every evening with an enthusiasm that never faded, as if she were just as surprised as he was that they still had this, that they had made it through another day. One night, as he sat on the floor beside her, watching as she gnawed on a well-loved toy Emily had given her, he let himself think about something he hadn't dared to before. The future. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if this job would last, if this shelter would always have space for him, if the world would decide to take this away, like it had taken so much before. But for now, he had Maggie, he had work, he had warmth, and for the first time in a long time, he had hope. Winter had started to loosen its grip on the city, though the chill still clung stubbornly to the air. The snow on the sidewalks had begun to melt into slushy puddles, and the days stretched longer, teasing the promise of spring. Life at the diner had settled into a routine for Daniel. Early mornings, hours spent scrubbing dishes, the comforting hum of conversations he was slowly starting to feel like a part of. He had never expected to feel comfortable in a place like this again, to feel like he belonged anywhere, but with each passing day it became harder to ignore the simple truth. Things were better now, and yet, as he sat outside the shelter one evening, Maggie curled up at his feet. He couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest. She was stronger now, healthier than she had ever been since the day he found her. Her fur, once matted and dull, was thick and soft beneath his fingers. Her leg had healed, and she no longer limped when she ran, bounding through the small park across from the shelter with boundless energy. She had grown into herself, into the bright, affectionate soul she had always been meant to be. But Daniel knew better than anyone that love alone wasn't enough. He had done everything he could for her, but there were things he couldn't give her. A stable home, a backyard to run in, the certainty that there would always be food in her bowl. The shelter was a temporary roof, and Jake's diner was a job, but neither of those things were permanent. He was still one bad stroke of luck away from losing everything, and Maggie deserved more than uncertainty. The thought had been gnawing at him for days, and he had fought it every step of the way. But when Liam called him one evening, telling him about a couple who had been looking to adopt a dog, someone older, settled, with a warm home and steady lives, Daniel had known. It was time. They met at Liam's clinic, a place that had become strangely familiar to Daniel now. He had brought Maggie in for checkups over the weeks, each time greeted by Liam's easygoing manner and the quiet efficiency of his staff. This time, though, was different. The couple, Mark and Susan, were already waiting when he arrived. They were in their late 40s, maybe early 50s, dressed in simple but comfortable clothes, the kind of people who carried a quiet kindness in their smiles. Susan had warm brown eyes that softened when she looked at Maggie, and Mark had the broad, steady presence of someone who had spent his life building things with his hands. They were the kind of people Daniel had always assumed would never notice someone like him. "Is this her?" Susan asked, crouching down as Maggie bounded forward, tail wagging furiously. Daniel nodded, watching as Maggie sniffed at Susan's hands, then licked them, tail thumping wildly against the floor. Mark chuckled. "She's got a good spirit," he said. "You can tell she's been through a lot, but she's still got love in her." Daniel forced a small smile. "Yeah," he murmured. "She does." Susan reached out, running gentle fingers through Maggie's fur. "She's beautiful," she said softly, "and we'd love to give her a home." Daniel's chest tightened. He knew this was the right thing, the smart thing, but hearing it out loud made it feel unbearably real. Liam, who had been standing off to the side, cleared his throat. "Daniel's taken good care of her," he said. "She wouldn't be here without him." Mark looked up at Daniel then, studying him in a way that made Daniel resist the urge to step back. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. "She means a lot to you, doesn't she?" Mark asked. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice rough. "She does." There was a pause, and then Mark smiled, a small, knowing thing. "Then you should know she'll be loved," he said simply. "We're not looking for just any dog. We want one who needs us as much as we need her. And if she means that much to you, we'll make sure she never forgets where she came from." Susan nodded. "You'd be welcome to visit her," she added quickly. "Any time you want." Daniel let out a slow breath. He hadn't expected that. Maggie was circling Susan now, nuzzling against her as if she had already made up her mind. She looked so happy, so at ease, as if she had known all along that this was where she was supposed to be. Daniel knelt down, running a hand through her fur one last time. She looked up at him, tongue lolling slightly, blissfully unaware of what this moment meant. "You're going to be okay, kid," he murmured. Maggie licked his fingers, tail wagging. He swallowed hard and stood. "All right," he said, the words tasting like both relief and loss. "She's yours." The handoff was simple. Liam provided the paperwork, the couple signed it, and just like that, Maggie belonged to someone else. Susan lifted her into her arms easily, holding her as if she had always been meant to be there. Daniel forced himself to step back, stuffing his hands into his pockets. He had done what was best for her. That was all that mattered. As he turned to leave, he heard Susan's voice behind him. "Daniel?" He paused, glancing over his shoulder. She hesitated, then offered a small smile. "Would you like to come by this weekend? Maybe take her for a walk?" He blinked. He hadn't expected that. He had thought this was goodbye. For a moment, he considered saying no, walking away, letting Maggie settle into her new life without him. But then he saw the way she was still looking at him, ears perked, tail still wagging. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." Susan's smile widened. Then it settled. And just like that, Daniel realized that maybe this wasn't an ending after all. Maybe it was just the start of something new. The day was crisp and cool, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, unmarred by clouds. Daniel walked with steady steps down the quiet suburban street, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. It still felt strange walking through a neighborhood like this, lined with neatly trimmed lawns, mailboxes standing like sentinels at the edge of each driveway, the occasional laughter of children drifting through the air. It was a world away from the cold alleyways and empty streets he had once called home. He had thought more than once that he wouldn't return, not because he didn't want to see Maggie, but because part of him still struggled with the idea that she had moved on to something better without him. He had given her away, placed her in hands that could offer her the life he never could. And yet, as he stood at the edge of the driveway, staring up at the modest but inviting home that now belonged to her, he felt something stir in his chest. Not regret, but something softer, a belonging he hadn't expected. The front door swung open before he could knock, and Susan stepped onto the porch, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Daniel, right on time," she said cheerfully, wiping her hands on the dish towel slung over her shoulder. "Come on in. Someone's been waiting for you." Before he could respond, the sound of paws scrambling against hardwood filled the air, followed by a blur of golden fur barreling toward him. Maggie. She launched herself at him without hesitation, her small frame colliding against his legs as her tail wagged furiously, a joyful whimper escaping her throat. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, bending down to catch her in his arms. Her tongue immediately found his face, licking at his chin, her entire body vibrating with excitement. "Hey, kid," he murmured, ruffling her fur. "You remember me, huh?" Susan laughed, watching the reunion with fond amusement. "Oh, she remembers you all right. She gets antsy every time we mention your name. We've been telling her all morning that you were coming, and she wouldn't sit still." Daniel smiled, feeling the warmth of her words settle deep in his chest. Maggie had grown since he last saw her. She was no longer the frail, shivering thing he had found in a dumpster, no longer the sickly pup he had feared wouldn't make it through the winter. Her coat was shinier, her body stronger, and her eyes, once filled with uncertainty and quiet desperation, now sparkled with a happiness that hadn't been there before. She was home. Mark appeared in the doorway then, nodding in greeting. "Good to see you, Daniel. Coffee?" Daniel hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yeah, that'd be nice." Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with something sweet, cinnamon maybe. A fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows against the walls. It was the kind of home Daniel had never allowed himself to dream about, a place where laughter and warmth weren't just fleeting moments, but an everyday occurrence. Susan poured him a cup of coffee, sliding it across the kitchen table before taking a seat across from him. Maggie sat at his feet, resting her chin on his knee, perfectly content just to be near him. "How have things been?" Susan asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Daniel exhaled slowly, considering his answer. "Good," he said, and for the first time in a long time he meant it. Life had changed since he had let Maggie go. It hadn't been easy. There were still nights when doubt crept in, when the weight of his past threatened to pull him back. But things were different now. With Jake's help, he had moved out of the shelter and into a small apartment above the diner. It wasn't much, just a one-room place with a rickety old heater and a window that sometimes got stuck, but it was his. His name was on the lease, his key fit the lock, and for the first time in years, he had a door that was his to close at the end of the day. The job at the diner had turned from part-time to something steadier. Jake didn't say much about it, but one day, after a particularly busy shift, he had tossed a set of keys at Daniel and muttered, "You open tomorrow." It wasn't just a job anymore, it was stability. Emily still checked in on him, still made sure he had what he needed, but it was different now. It wasn't pity, it was friendship. She had helped him find a second-hand couch for the apartment, a bookshelf that sat mostly empty except for a few old paperbacks he had picked up from a thrift store. For the first time in a long time, he was building something. And yet, sitting there in that warm kitchen with Maggie pressed against his leg, he realized that the thing he had feared most, losing her, had never really happened. She was still his in a way. "That's really good to hear," Susan said, smiling. "You deserve it." Daniel nodded, still running his fingers through Maggie's fur. "Thanks." They talked for a while, about Maggie's antics, about how she had claimed the couch as her personal throne, about the way she still tilted her head in that curious way whenever she didn't understand something. Susan and Mark loved her, that much was obvious, and that knowledge settled something deep inside Daniel, easing a part of him that had remained restless ever since he had let her go. After a while, Susan stood, clapping her hands together. "Well, if you're up for it, I think Maggie would love to go for a walk." The word walk sent Maggie into a flurry of excitement, her tail wagging so fast her whole body wiggled. Daniel laughed. "Yeah," he said, pushing back from the table. "I'd like that." Outside, the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, painting the world in soft shades of gold and amber. The air was crisp, but not biting, the last traces of winter lingering, but losing their grip. Maggie trotted ahead happily, her paws kicking up small tufts of grass as she explored. Daniel walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, watching as she bounded forward, then circled back to check if he was still there, as if making sure he wasn't going anywhere. "I'm not going anywhere, kid," he murmured. Maggie let out a small, happy bark as if she understood. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs. For so long he had been moving, wandering, drifting without direction. But now, standing there in the quiet of the evening, watching Maggie chase after a stray leaf, as if it were the greatest treasure in the world, he realized something. He wasn't lost anymore, neither of them were. They had both found their way home,